Chapter 2. The ground was wet and muddy. A dozen feet past the gate and Crawford's shoes were soaked through. He squinted ahead into the haze, trying to avoid the big puddles. Green, wearing boots, walked in a straight line away from the cemetery gate, toward an orange glow at the top of a slight rise. The glow came from a half-dozen electric lanterns, set up underneath a plastic tarp stretched over an area 3 plots wide. The tarp was fastened to 4 metal poles and hung high over their heads. 2 men in uniforms similar to Green's stood under the tarp, dressed in shirt sleeves, arms shiny with rain and perspiration. One was tall and thin, the other medium height, stocky, with a handlebar mustache. The thin one was leaning on a shovel, the other was snapping pictures. They turned at Green's approach. "Harris!" The stocky man smiled. "You look like a drowned rat." He and Green shook hands. "Hank, this is Detective Crawford. Detective, this is Hank Hart. He's in charge here." "Sheriff," Crawford said. "Acting sheriff," Hart said. "While the boss is down in Myrtle Beach, the man with the shovel here is Leonard Callahan." Crawford shook hands all around. He pointed to the tarp. "Smart idea." "We wanted to give you a chance to see it in situ," Callahan said. "In situ." Hart smiled. "You trying to impress the big city detective?" They all laughed except Callahan. "Just doing my job," he said. Crawford sized Callahan up. Button down by the book. Throw anything out of the ordinary at him, and he'd fold up like an accordion. "And I appreciate it." Crawford made eye contact with him, and then Hart. "I appreciate you keeping the site intact." "It was a lot more intact before it started raining," Hart said. The camera, a Polaroid, hung from a strap around his neck, as did a large, clear plastic envelope. Crawford sized him up too. Soft on the outside, but he liked the way the man carried himself. He would do. Hart reached into the envelope and pulled out a handful of pictures. "Here," he said, motioning Crawford forward. "Come stand under this so they don't get too wet." Crawford moved, stepping around a portable generator. The first picture Hart showed him had been taken at dusk. The clouds were black and threatening. Whoever had snapped it had been standing 10 feet away from the tombstone and gravesite. Surrounding both was a perfectly formed circle made out of fist-sized stones. Within the circle, all the grass had been pulled out, leaving bare earth. Crawford looked at the picture, then up at the site. The stones were still there. It looked just like the other sites had. This was Fellows's work, no doubt about it. Might as well sign his name in big letters in that dirt. "We think he was here this afternoon," Callahan said. Crawford was surprised. "He did this during the middle of the day?" "Could have been last night late," Hart put in. "Maybe early morning. This isn't Baltimore, detective. Not a lot of people around here to watch, no matter what the time." Crawford nodded. Hart flipped to the next picture, a closer shot of the inside of the circle. Looking at it from this distance, you could tell the earth was freshly turned. Hart showed him a dozen more photos. The gravesite from a few different angles, a boot impression in the dirt that may or may not have belonged to Fellows. Crawford bet not. A few shots of the tombstone itself, Callahan holding an ultraviolet light next to the surface. "We dusted this one and the next couple over for prints," Hart said. "Nothing." Crawford nodded. "Also just like the other sites. Fellows wasn't making it easy for them." Crawford crossed under the tarp and stood next to the tombstone. "Anyone got a flashlight?" "Hold on." A big blue duffel bag was lying under the tarp, with the words, "Property of Frederick County Sheriff's Department" stenciled across it in white letters. Hart reached into the bag and handed Crawford a flashlight. He switched it on and ran the beam over the tombstone. Catherine Holder, 1862 to 1927. Beloved mother and wife Hart was standing at his shoulder. "The others were women too, weren't they?" Crawford nodded. "What's the significance of that?" "Damned if I know." The FBI shrink who had driven up from Washington had made a big deal about Fellows' relationships with women too. Crawford remembered 6 detectives and Joan Kerman lying on her kitchen counter. Charisse, the shrink in the lieutenant's office, looking at pictures of Graham lying in the alley. Fellows had a deep-seated the shrink in the lieutenant's office looking at pictures of Joan Kerman lying on her kitchen counter. Charisse Graham lying in the alley. Fellows had a deep-seated hatred of women, the shrink had said. 10 minutes in, Crawford had had enough. "When this guy knifed me," he interrupted. "When he shot Politi—" "Randy," the lieutenant warned. "I didn't see any women around," Crawford finished. Of course not, the FBI man said soothingly. But his actions were driven. Crawford snorted. You want to know what drove his actions? The lieutenant stood up. That's enough, Detective Crawford. Agent Reynolds doesn't need. I'll tell you what drove his actions, Crawford had said. The fucker enjoyed it. Hart cleared his throat. We might as well get to it. Yeah. Crawford turned around and saw Green and Callahan holding shovels. He held his hand out. Let me. He wanted to show his appreciation in some way. Callahan and Hart had stayed on after shift to give him a chance to see the crime scene. Callahan passed him a shovel. We'll take turns. Sure. The handle of the shovel was wet and slippery in his grasp. The ground underneath his feet was muddy and soft. He walked to the center of the circle, put the shovel in the ground, and started digging. Crawford had missed Politti's funeral. He had missed his son Donnie's birth. He had spent a month in the hospital recuperating, then 6 more at home, carrying around a plastic bag attached to his intestines. He put on 20 pounds. He and Sharon fought like cats and dogs. Mandel and Speed, John Spetsikowski, kept him up to date on the Fellows case. The Pennsylvania driver's license was a fake. They weren't sure of his real name. They brought Crawford books full of pictures to look at, convicted criminals and suspected ones. He didn't recognize anyone. A few weeks after Donnie was born, they brought him the pictures of what Fellows had done in 2F. They'd waited because Joan Kerman had been 7 months pregnant at the time of her murder. The evidence suggested, shouted, that Fellows had attacked her because of her pregnancy. Crawford went back to work with a new partner, Jimmy Doyle, a transfer out of Vice, a few months younger than him. Doyle had known Politti, too. Both of them put in time helping out Mandel and Speed on the Fellows case. 2 years passed. The case went on the back burner. Fellows seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth. Not a bad strategy, in Crawford's opinion, for a cop killer. Crawford kept looking anyway. 9 months ago, he had found him. It was a Tuesday in early November. He was working the midnight to 8 shift. Doyle had fallen asleep sitting up in his chair. Crawford didn't feel like sleeping. He wandered downstairs in the station house, intending to get a cup of coffee from the wagon. On the way out, he passed the fax machine. The incoming tray was overflowing. He pulled out a stack of paper and flipped through it. Weird shit. From a crime scene in a little town near the Virginia border. A place called Jordan's Creek. Grave robbing and desecration. Someone had mutilated a corpse. A security camera at the local 7-Eleven had caught the suspect on video buying gas and a lottery ticket. The local cops were passing on a picture. It was fuzzy. The suspect had long, dark hair and a goatee, but Crawford recognized him instantly. It was Fellows. They sent the picture down to Washington for some computer modeling. This time, he had to admit, the FBI came through. A day or so later, the system kicked back a picture of a John Lee Fellows who'd been arrested for assault in Virginia, back in 1987. The big shots talked. Fellows was a cop killer. Now he was a grave robber, a ghoul in the classic sense of the word. They decided to set up a task force, multi-jurisdictional. Crawford was nominally second in command, but a couple months in, and he was the go-to guy. He'd been all over Maryland this year, west as far as Asher Glade, east all the way to Ocean Pines. Now here he was, right in the middle of the state, in Burkittsville. A foot down, the shovel smacked up against something hard. Over here, he said, motioning Green to dig closer to him. 5 minutes later, they were looking at the top of a coffin. A nice coffin. Crawford grabbed the flashlight and shone it up and down the length of the dark hardwood box. He frowned. Something was wrong. What was the date on the tombstone again? 1927, Hart said. This coffin's a hell of a lot newer than that. Green nodded. Couple years at the most. Crawford and Green exchanged glances. Fellows had put a new coffin in an old grave? Why? How? They went back to digging. In 15 minutes, a pile of mud 3 feet high circled the excavation. Crawford was soaked to the bone. Sometime during the digging, it had started raining again. The tarp protected them from above, but the ground was turning into swamp beneath their feet. Crawford set the shovel down and wiped his brow. Let me. Callahan climbed down and took Crawford's shovel. Hart took Green's. Up top, Green lit a cigarette. Bugs swarmed around the lanterns. Crawford watched Callahan and Hart dig and wondered what they would find inside the coffin. You live in Baltimore? Green asked. No, just outside. Town called Woodmore. You like it? The kids like it. My wife likes it. Crawford shrugged. We used to have a little row house downtown. I like that better. I could never live in the city, Green said. All those people. And the smells. Forget it. You grow up around here? No. Troy, New York, right near Albany. Went to college for a couple years over in Montgomery. Met a girl from Hagerstown. Got married. Got divorced. You ain't divorced yet, kid, Hart called up from the grave. Papers come this week. Hart shook his head. Which makes you a damn fool. He looked at Crawford. Kid's making a mistake. Green smiled. Deputy loves to tell me my business. Just trying to help you through the follies of youth. Hart climbed out of the hole and walked over to the duffel bag. Besides, I recall you coming to me for advice more than once. Ain't that right, Harris? Like hell. Why do you think I always volunteer for graveyard shift? To get away from you. Well, you got the graveyard now, son. We all do. Hart pulled a bottle of water out of the duffel bag and took a long, slow swig. Can I get some? Crawford asked. Hart handed him the bottle. Go on, finish it. Crawford did. Then he walked back to the edge of the hole and peered down. The coffin was entirely exposed. Callahan had put his shovel down and was running his hand along the edge of the wooden box. It looked pretty close to brand spanking new. How do you figure this? Callahan asked. Crawford shook his head. Bad thoughts were forcing their way to the surface. He forced them back down. I don't. Callahan pushed at the top of the box. The lid's loose. It ain't gonna come off, is it? Hart asked. Callahan tried the lid. No. Well, let's be careful with it, till we get back to town. Hart stepped past Crawford and threw 2 long cloth straps to Callahan. Hart climbed down and helped Callahan run the straps through the handles of the coffin and then underneath it. Then they tied ropes to the straps. It took 20 sweaty minutes for all 4 of them to drag the coffin up and out of the grave. Every so often, Crawford would wonder how Fellows had managed it by himself. The answer, of course, was that he couldn't have, which meant that he had to have help. But who in God's name would help him? No one. So how could he have managed it himself? And so on. When the coffin was out, Hart slid a gurney underneath the box. Crawford was soaked in sweat and rain and covered in mud. So was everybody else. But they still had to fill the grave back in. Crawford picked up a shovel again and threw a spadeful of earth into the hole. Hey, hold on a second. That was Callahan. He jumped back down into the grave, then back up a second later, holding something about the size of a football in his hand. He brushed the mud off it and held it up for them all to see. What do you make of this? They all gathered round. It was under the coffin, Callahan said. Weird, Crawford said. You mind? He took the object from Callahan. It was a bunch of sticks, tied together with twine. What the hell? Crawford turned it over and over in his hands. It looks like a little stick man, doesn't it?